Welcome. Our topic today is conditional access. Today we'll talk about zero trust foundations, why and how to leverage conditional access policies. For additional background on conditional access, make sure you check out the resources at the end of the presentation and of course Adam's blog this month, which walks you right through how to set up a very common conditional access policy, straightforward. Whether you're just getting started or you've been doing conditional access for a while, or maybe you even have 50 policies in place, I'm sure you'll get something out of this today. With that said, joining me today is Adam Oakes, practice manager from our managed services division called Office 365 and Azure Advantage Services, where his team provides both proactive and reactive managed services to our customers on a monthly basis. As well as being one of the biggest geeks I know, he is also a grill master specializing in smoked meats, especially briskets. Please don't ask him about that unless we have time at the end, because he'll never stop talking about his technique. Welcome, Adam, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ken. Looking forward to it.
All right. Let's quickly go over the agenda real quick. What is conditional access? Why would we use it? Some best practices. Talking about risk-based conditional access, which is a little bit more advanced. How to get started. Adam's going to walk you through about a 30-minute demo or so of creating policies from scratch, and all some of the lessons learned that he's worked with his customers on a monthly basis. And of course, we always end with licensing to talk about what's needed to actually do this. And then we'll talk about some useful resources, right? So before we get started, let's just see who we've got here with us today. We're going to just do a short poll. If you could just quickly tell us what area of your organization you represent. This way we have a good idea, who's actually with us today, and we know what kind of conversation technically we can have with you all. So please just take a second to give us your poll results. Looks like the overwhelming majority is IT folks, so which is what I expected for this topic today. So thank you for doing the poll results, and we'll go ahead and get started. So let me first take a second and explain why our title of the session today is Zero Trust Foundations, why and how to leverage conditional access policies. As you probably know, Zero Trust has three guiding principles, right? That's verify explicitly, use least privilege, and assume breach. Well, today we're going to talk mostly about verify explicitly, but with risk-based conditional access, we can also get signals from some of the other Defender products that can protect your organization for least privilege and assuming breach by looking at analytics and signals from all over the actual security graph, right? So that'll take more sense. It'll make more sense as we go forward with this. But I just want to bring this up and say this is really, in essence, in summary, this is exactly what conditional access is all about. It's the foundational tool for enforcing secure identities, which is the very first thing you want to do in Zero Trust, regardless of where your users work and what devices they're using. So Adam, tell us at a high level, what is conditional access and how it works?
Sure, thanks, Ken. So conditional access is really a core foundation that a lot of people go through and look at when they're starting their journey into the cloud. But I think especially when you look at some of the last several years, the evolution and new security features and new options that have come out have really made it worthwhile going back and revisiting potentially what you're doing. The modern security perimeter that kind of extends over our organization and agencies section inside of what we're doing in the cloud ultimately is going to come down to user identity, how you identify people, and how you decide what and when they should have access. Conditional access is basically the gatekeeper for all of that. At its very high level core, when you go through and look at it, there's a signal at the start that is going through and saying a user's trying to log in or some sort of starting mechanism. From that, you then go through and have to make a decision on, well, what do I want to do with this user? There's a whole bunch of different options in there. We'll discuss some of those today, and ultimately that leads all the way to enforcement. Now, we'll get into some of the different various topics. I'll tell you guys at the start going into this, I am very much a demo happy person. I go to conferences fairly often. I speak at conferences fairly often. I never felt like I got a ton out of it when someone was just lecturing at me at a slide deck. So as Ken kind of mentioned earlier, a large portion of what we'll be doing today is actual demo and walking through some of the options. But at its core, you should think of conditional access as one of the entry or gate level points that controls the keys to the kingdom of everything that you're doing in the cloud.
Makes sense to me, Adam. Thank you for talking about that. And remember, conditional access policies aren't enforced until after your first factor, right? So it's like you got to get through that first gate, then this is the next gate. So it's a process for policies. All right, let's take another poll real quick. Are you currently using conditional access? We'd love to hear about it. Are you using just basic conditional access? Are you using risk-based conditional access? You're not using either, or are you just not sure yet? So we'd love to just take a second here and see what you guys are all doing. And it looks like the majority so far is people are using basic conditional access. So hopefully you'll learn some good things today about risk-based conditional access, and we'll talk about the licensing at the end that's required for that as well. So thank you for taking that poll results, and we'll keep moving on. So Adam, tell us why an organization would want to use conditional access. You kind of mentioned this already a little bit, but just take us through a little bit further.
Sure, yeah. So conditional access, especially in its modern form, really allows you to get granular in deciding who and when and why you want to allow people to have access to your system. I think natively all of us, and especially from the poll we just saw with people going through and using basic authentication, when I think of conditional access, I think multi-factor authentication. That's first step most people go to. But really, it's evolved to be so much more since then. You guys can see on the picture that put together that Microsoft did a wonderful job on. When you're talking about the original signal that comes in on conditional access, there's so many more things that you can trigger off of now. So we'll talk about real-time risk, which is one of the more advanced features that you need Azure ADP 2 for, but even stuff like certain devices or certain applications. One of my favorite things that we see a lot of customers do is you can go through now, for instance, and say, all right, well, one of the things I'm going to proactively do is only allow devices that I know I'm managing to access my system. And so I can basically at the forefront say, well, I don't want any random Joe Schmo to connect into my system. I only want people that are in hybrid AD joined devices. So therefore I can control and I can see what's going on. If you just think about that in practical terms, that's such a huge security blocker for you that, even if a user's credentials got compromised, even if somehow the MFA got compromised, well, they're clearly not going to have a machine joined to your actual endpoint management system or to your actual Active Directory. So a lot of really, really cool things you can do. And I'll say for me personally, not only that, you can really get granular with it. The area that we work in when we're going through talking about government customers and the industry space that we see often all the time, even doing simple stuff such as I only want to allow connections from the US, or I want to block connections from countries we know we've had problems with. Again, something I see as pretty low-hanging fruit that has a pretty massive impact into the security of what you're going through and doing. I'll also say too, you'll hear zero trust mentioned several times during this presentation. I'm sure it's something you've heard talked about a lot. Zero trust is the future. It's what Microsoft talks about whenever they're talking about their new posture and where they're going. And going through the principle of zero trust and trying to align yourself in that direction as you move forward, conditional access is at its core fundamental to what you're going through and doing. As Ken kind of said, right in there when you're trying to examine what's going on from the start, conditional access is arguably the best tool in Microsoft's tool set in order to how you go through and address that and be aware of it.
Absolutely. And it just makes sense, right? When we talked about those three pillars, the least privilege, right? Why would you open up all these countries if there's no reason to be doing business with those countries, right? So cut those off, huge impact just by implementing that one policy, right? It's great stuff, Adam. Thank you. So you've met with lots of customers, and over the years, you've been putting together a list of best practices. Can you talk a little bit about some of these best practices, Adam?
Yeah, I definitely can. And shout out to Pierre Eves and a couple of our other colleagues as well, too, who helped us put this together from what they've seen. I'm not going to just read through the whole list. You guys can read a list on your own, but I'll talk generally about some of the stuff that you want to go through and do. One of the things I'll say first and foremost, when you're going through and doing it, you should basically be using conditional access for all of your users. You can look at some of the security baseline recommendations or some of the stuff that are in like Compliance Manager for the various sets you need to do. And I'll say best practices from the beginning is you basically want to have policies that apply to all your admins. You want to have policies that apply to all your users, and you can figure out how to qualify that for exceptions and what needs to happen from there. But at an entry point, this should be the first, knight in armor standing at your gate, trying to go through and protect you from the beginning. I'll also say minimize the number of policies. Ken and I were laughing this morning as we got together. I will not say who the client is, but one of our clients that we're good friends with, put in a request to me one time, oh, hey, can you go in and review our conditional access policies? I was like, oh, yeah, sure. I'll put together an hour meeting for us. It'll be simple. They have like 58 policies. That can happen, especially when you get in a larger organization that you have multiple hands in the pot. But trying to minimize your number of policies is important. There's some nuance here, though. You don't want to get to the point that you have 3 policies and then you don't have the customization to do what you want. But combining like for like, combining purpose for purpose is always a pretty good idea. And it just makes it easier for you to troubleshoot. I can tell you, anytime you're getting to the 15, 20 plus range, when you're going through and looking at policies, if one's not working, it's always, unraveling a tangled mess of strings to figure out which one's actually impacting you and causing it. Also, I think it's super important. I'll talk a little bit about this when we actually get into the demo, but know what you're doing. A change management process is going to be critical to anything you do. Again, shout out to Pierre's who helps us with all of that and helps us to kind of realize the importance of it. But a good example, one of the newer policies they put out that has a lot of value, just by default, when you decide you want to turn it on, creates 2 policies for you, one of which actually completely blocks non-modern authentication clients. If you don't know that that's turning on, you could just break it in the middle of a workday. So having conditional access policies, doing research, working with a partner like us or another partner you trust that can go out and test stuff in a lab for you, all of that stuff is really good, and I would encourage you to do. The other thing I'll say too, which is not necessarily listed on here, but I think is super important, always have a break glass account. A break glass account is the idea of an account that is excluded from what you're doing, that you have the ability to go in to log in. You can keep the credentials stored in somewhere. The account can even be disabled most of the time, but just have that emergency account to get in. I have multiple times worked with clients in the past as they were going through to implement their conditional access posture. They literally locked out every single one of their admins. Keep in mind, the Azure portal and the Office 365 admin portal are services that you can put conditional access policies around. So if you go through and block access and configure it incorrectly, you can literally lock yourself out of your account. Microsoft can help you. You just have to contact them through support and go through and get help. But just be aware, be cautious of what you're doing. We'll get to some of these other ones when we go through in the demo. There are definitely some best practices of like only switching to modern authentication clients, doing some of the stuff like that. That's really good.
Right. And you actually mentioned a bunch of these in your blog as well, like number 3, standard naming conventions. I can't imagine having a bunch of policies and not understanding what's behind them, right? So really coming up with standard naming conventions. I'm sure you'll talk about that more. And then the what if tool, I'm sure you're going to talk about that. So great best practices there. Thanks, Adam. So this is where it all the rubber hits the road, right? As far as defining the policies, creating the common signals. And this is what, the security graph on the back end is all collecting these signals, right? So talk to us a little bit about common signals and some of the things that you've seen customers do and how they do it.
Sure, yeah, and we'll even look at some of these when we go through and do a demo. But as Ken said, I'm about to get nerdy on you guys, so bear with me if that's not your thing. There's a lot of different ways of modern conditional access policies that you can really go in and leverage and add nuance to what you're doing. First and foremost, when you're going through and applying policies, you can say, I want to do it to all users. What we typically recommend is you can actually do it to certain groups. You can do like security groups that you apply. Similar to probably advice you've been given for forever in the cloud, I'm a huge fan of managing security group membership and creating your policies on those groups. It's way easier if you have a security group that's called all office workers, and you go through and create conditional access policies that apply to all office workers. Then when you hire a new person, all you have to do is throw them into the all office worker security group. You don't have to go and revisit every single conditional access policy and add them and remember to remove them. So definitely going through and looking at some of the stuff that you can do. Not only a best practice, but a common signal is triggering off of users or group memberships. Group membership is what we see a lot. The second one, and something again that I'm seeing a ton more often, is IP location information. This is really used in twofold. It's a very common request that we get from clients or we have from people that are wanting to implement. Well, I want to handle the clients that are coming in from my own physical office different than I would for a connection that's coming in from an external IP I don't know. Especially if you're a company that works with the DoD or has badge scanning to get into your office. Well, if someone's sitting on a workstation in your office, you probably are a lot more confident that they are who they say they are, that they should be there, than someone connecting from an IP that you have no idea where that IP is. So the ability to go through and do stuff like filtering or specific rules that I'm going to treat people that are on my network different. This is the exact same thing you see with VPNs. So if you have a VPN that you have people people go through and connect for your system, you can put that VPN as a known location through IP-based filtering and conditional access policies and say, okay, I'm going to do certain things with that. I actually even have a client that literally the only way you can get into their system is if you're on a VPN. So if you were to go and hit the login page on Azure and try to log in as a user and you weren't on the VPN, it just errors out and doesn't let you. But once you connect on the VPN, it then allows you to grant access. It's a conditional access policy that's doing that for them. The second part of that is you will see there's known locations of countries. One of my favorite low-hanging fruit things that you can do is going through there and filtering by countries. If you are a small town or you're a county and you're sitting in the middle of the United States, there's probably not a lot of reasons you need to have people other from the US connecting. Now, maybe there's situations of, oh, well, Tom's going on vacation and he's going to be in Europe for a week. Well, there's a very simple solution. Because you can do the membership by that, just have an exclusions group that you set up. One of my clients specifically that we go through and partner with has an exclusion groups that temporarily removes people from being included in the block all traffic outside of the US so they can, if they travel remotely, can do that. And then they basically, the partner that I work in literally just goes in and sets a timed email to come back the day they're supposed to come back to vacation, that puts in the request back to our team to, hey, remove them out of that group. So therefore they're then stuck back in the normal blocking US location. We also even do stuff like monthly reviews with them to go through and make sure that that's being up to date. But so two different things you can do with IP-based location filtering there. The device filtering is another one that, again, is really, really cool. This falls into two situations. Again, with device filtering, I can say I only want managed devices by me. So if someone's going to connect from a cell phone, I'm only going to do it on cell phones that I'm managing through MDM, that I know have the compliance and configuration policies that I want. Similarly, I'm only going to allow Windows 10 or Mac machines to connect that are being managed actively by my Active Directory or by hybrid by my domain itself. Again, way more control over devices that you're doing. That also, even if credentials get leaked, and instantly blocks it out. Similarly, that on a device, you can do device platforms themselves. So not only the compliance status if it's managed in you, but I can say, for instance, okay, I only want to allow Windows machines to connect. I have another customer I work with that ultimately has pretty strict regulations around how they handle their data. And one of the things that they do is, well, they didn't want to go through and put in all of the controls related to their Windows machines because they have other parts of the business that don't have to meet those compliance regulations. So instead, they did a policy that basically says, we're only going to allow Windows machines to connect. We're not going to allow phones at all. And we're only going to allow browsers to connect. We're not going to allow the physical clients. And that's how they control, ensuring that, it's not, people are not storing data locally. Application, I hybrided that one there at the end there, but you can go through and you can say, again, only certain like browsers can connect, or only non-active sync clients can connect, or only applications that do modern authentication. All that type of stuff you can go through and do. You can also trigger the policies based off specific scope of application as well too. So I can go through and say, okay, I only want to handle differently what I'm doing with SharePoint, or I only want to handle what I'm doing differently for Exchange Online, so email and stuff. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be everything all one way or the other. Then we get into the really fancy, cool stuff, the real-time calculated risk detection. You have to have Azure AD P2 for this. You'll probably hear that a couple times, but this is where you can get to some of the really transformative, cool things you can see. This is also where you start getting into the second pillar of zero trust architecture when we're talking about what you can do. Microsoft proactively checks the risk-based status of every user as well as every session login that they do. So those are two independent things. And you can basically trigger certain actions based off of how risky you think that user is or how risky you think that login session is. Now, this is not a presentation on just risk-based stuff, but for instance, one of the triggers that would increase risk-based, if I see someone connect from an IP that they've never used before, well, that could be harmless. It could be that they're traveling and they're in a hotel and it's perfectly okay. But it also could be that it's someone that's not them. So the fact that they are connecting from an IP they haven't seen before, Microsoft is going to make that connection session slightly more risky. And you can actually trigger different actions based off of how risky the connection or the user is. So I could, for instance, say, if you think this connection is more risky, well, make the user go through and do MFA, or maybe even make the user reset their password. You can go pretty far with it on what you want to do. The final pillar we have there for common signals is Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. This does stuff like application access, and it's monitored in real time. So going through and doing stuff like, again, is the device compliant? What are you doing with it? All that type of stuff is some of the cool stuff you can see there. The other thing I'll mention here, and we'll get in at the end, the newest thing that's come out is app enforced restrictions. You can do some really cool stuff. The only apps that do this are Teams, SharePoint, and Exchange Online right now. But one of the most common ones you see, I can, for instance, set up through conditional access policies enforcing you cannot download files from my SharePoint to your device, or you can only download it to your device if it's managed inside of my system. Some pretty cool stuff you can do there.
Very cool. Very cool. And so like basically Microsoft security engine is collecting this data, all these signals from on a per user basis, right? And then over time it learns these tendencies of that person. So it's constantly doing this evaluation before every single login, right? That's pretty amazing stuff there. Talk about some of these common decisions and policies. It comes down to blocking access or granting access, right?
Yeah, and we'll see some of this when we go into the demo. But as you go through and decide what you're wanting to do, it's honestly a little confusing when you first go in and start interacting with conditional access policies, because you need to write them to do specific things. And so you may go through and say, all right, I'm going to include my office, and I'm going to include the networks that I know to be on. But then my decision there may be, all right, I'm going to go through and do this and grant access for it. But you then may also have a similar policy that excludes those locations, but the action that you take is block access rather. And so there's different ways that you can go through and architect it. The common things that you're going to have to go through and do is decide how you want to approach it and what those policies you want to do. Ken did a wonderful job of pointing out some of the most common things we see from our clients. Require MFA, require the device to be marked as compliant or hybrid joined, specific client apps that you want to do. When you hear the idea of approved client apps, that goes back to, again, something like MDM or a MAM policy when you're doing an Intune or endpoint management. Say, okay, I want to allow Outlook for iOS, but I don't want to allow the native mail apps from Apple or Android, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then again, I will talk briefly on the demo about the some of the app protection policy that's in preview, as well as some of the app enforced restrictions.
Sounds good, Adam. And then you talked a little bit about this already, but anything special about this slide here about the risk-based conditional access that you want to point out that we haven't mentioned yet?
Largely, this is just for people to go through and reference after the fact for them to know what's going on. I do think it's probably important to know when you're going through and looking about the different options you have. There's probably stuff in there that you're not considering or not doing. One of the clients that I'm working with, for instance, is doing a lot of B2C stuff where they're basically serving constituents of their agency that are not members of their organization. They don't have physical accounts, but you can do conditional access to all the B2C stuff you're doing. So you can even do stuff like, okay, I'm going to put together specific terms of use that I want people to agree to, and I'm not going to allow them to access my system until they've actually read through the terms of use and agreed to it. That's something you can do today inside of conditional access policies. It's really cool. So again, this is mostly a reference slide for people to look back to later.
Yeah, and one thing I want to point out here is that if you start doing some testing with these policies, right, it could take up to 4 hours for them to be implemented, right? So just be aware that while you just made this and you saved the configuration of it, it could take up to 4 hours. It's usually more like about an hour or so, Adam, you think? But it could take up to 4 hours. It kind of
depends on what you're doing. Sometimes it can be a couple of minutes. It normally depends on the complexity of what you're doing. But just think about the math. How many different Azure AD servers are out there? When you update, how long is it going to take to propagate through everything? Oftentimes it's quick. General rule of thumb that I tell people is an hour it should be there. If it's not there by the next morning, that's when you restart, try it again, open up a ticket to Microsoft, whatever.
Gotcha. All right, we got another poll here real quick, and then we'll get to your demo here, Adam. But the poll question is do you own the licensing for risk-based conditional access? We're kind of curious if you own Azure Active Directory Plan 2. Just a simple question, yes or no, not sure. And we'll go ahead and go over the results, I guess, after we do the demo. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Adam, to take over the screen share for the demo.
Sounds good. I will go ahead and start sharing. So probably going to demo for about 15 minutes here. I wanted to go through, but as I kind of said, I'm a very much rubber meets the road guy. I'm a very much hands-on. Even if it's me watching someone else doing it, I always learn way better from that than just screenshots. So what I wanted to do today is actually walk through the wizard that they have on how you'd go through and create a conditional access policy. I'll talk about some of the different options and some of the areas you can flex with it to hopefully provide some context with you guys. And then I'm also at the end of the demo going to look at the what if tool, which is the best tool ever, especially if you have like 80 of these things and you're trying to figure out what goes on. So as you can probably see, you can actually access this through the Azure portal, which is interesting enough. But so that's where you're going to
Yeah,
go through and easily go ahead.
I'm not seeing the desktop yet. I'm going to go ahead and stop video because I think we're running into some bandwidth problems as well. So I'm going to stop my camera.
Sounds good. Give me a second. Let me try to share again and make sure people can see. All right, you all see my screen now?
It's coming. Yep, we got it. Thank you.
All right. Hopefully my network cooperates for us. But so as I was saying, you can see up here, it actually is the Azure portal where you log into. So go portal.azure.com, portal.azure.us based off of the cloud that you're in. And ultimately, when you get in there, the easiest way to find it, you can actually just search conditional access up here at the top. Now you'll see once this loads for me, it comes up there. It's the last thing I clicked on because I was preparing for this demo, so I can see it right here in my slide. But when you go into conditional access policies, it will pull up. This is actually the only policy I have on my lab right now. This is my own lab environment. This is what I actually did for the blog write-up, which is why that exists. But I want to talk through a couple things first and foremost. Just knowing what I'm going to need to do, I'm going to need to first acknowledge named locations. I want to look at some of the options that you can do inside of location-based filtering, but to do that, you have to have your locations established. So if I go here on the left-hand side of the navigation and go to named locations, you'll see I have a couple in here. I've added in a couple of countries. You can see actually when you look at countries locations, they just have this giant prefab list of countries for you. How it actually does this is whenever it looks for an IP, obviously you can do location-based filtering or geofencing based on what that IP is. So if I go through and I say, for instance, the US and I select the United States as my country, then it's going to go through and look at that IP and determine, is that connection coming from the geographical United States? You can get unknown. If it's unknown, typically that's going to filter as it's not from the country, obviously for security reasons. And then you can also do IP range based filtering. I have a couple of things here. I've created a hypothetical company office. I've also created the hypothetical location of my house. This would be if you're wanting to do stuff like VPN or your corporate office and do stuff like that. All you do for that is when you go in to add it, it literally wants you to name the location and then simply provide an IP. It's looking for a block of IP ranges for you to go through and add. You can do it in IPv6 or IPv4. Pretty easy to do. You'll also see the term trusted location thrown around with conditional access policies. The idea behind trusted locations is you can mark stuff like your company network and your corporate offices as trusted locations. And then you can, when you're creating policies, basically say, apply this to all trusted locations. One of the clients I worked with for a long time was an oil and gas company out in Australia. They had offices in basically every major city in Australia, as well as stuff like oil wells and stuff like that in the middle of nowhere. So we actually went in and did IP range based location filtering for every one of their offices. And if it was an office, we marked it as a trusted location. And that just made crafting the actual conditional access policies easier. The other thing I'll look in here, just because this is one of the ones that I think is cool that not a lot of people use, if you're wanting to do the terms of use example I talked about earlier, here's where you do it. You can actually come in here and you can see you give your terms a name, and then you can actually upload a physical document for people to see, choose the language of what it is, and then have all these cool options of require users to expand the terms of use, will require users to consent on every device. So once a user consents, is that good enough? Or every time they come for a new device? And do you want to expire the consent and make them like re-agree to it? Again, I mostly see this in the application of stuff like business to consumer and going through and doing some of the things with that. But I could easily see too, this could be a great thing that you could add if you're needing to do stuff for auditing for certain compliance regulations. Well, part of what you could do maybe is a terms of use that when your user logs in, they're agreeing that they understand they're accessing a government network and that there's certain data that needs to be protected and certain things that they have to do. Make them agree to that once a year. You include that as part of the information in your system security plan to provide to the auditor. That's a wonderful way to go through and meet that term. And I don't see nearly enough people use the terms of use section here.
Hey, time out for 1 second. We got two questions, one from Casey and one from Ralph that says, Ralph, let's talk about Ralph's first. It says IPv6 addresses come back as unknown. Are you familiar with that problem, or just curious if you've seen that?
I haven't seen that specifically. Ralph, you and I know each other. Let's just get together on this and go through and look on it on one time. Depending on how you surface the IPv6, I have had problems getting the ranges to work properly in the IPv6, but we can go through and look at that. I assume what Ralph is saying there is when it's going through and you actually are connecting through an IPv6, the system is processing you as unknown, which then means the location-based filtering is not working. But I'd want to take a look with you on that directly, Ralph. But
Sounds
I
good.
think I understand what you're asking.
Casey, were you just letting us know we had a question, or did you have a question as well, Casey?
I was, and you were on top of it, so thank you so
All right,
much.
thank you. Okay, continue, please, Adam.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, we'll actually go in here and I'll actually go to the policy of creating a policy from scratch. When you go in to create a policy, you'll see you have the create a new policy from templates, which is currently in preview. You may not see that in GCC and GCC High yet. The templates are pretty cool. When you go into there, you can see they basically have templates they want you where you select either devices or identities, and they have a whole bunch of things that they think are common best practices. If you're new to conditional access policies, this is a great way to go through and look at stuff that people are doing. They have their own naming convention or you can go and you can see they have the naming conventions they do. You can easily override this if you want, and it even gives you the option of if you want to turn it on or off. Pretty cool that they did this. It's nice to see this as options for people to go through and do. Again, devices have their own separate things that you can go through and look at as well. But for our purposes, I'm going to not do a thing from template. I'm going to come back in here and create a new policy from scratch. So this is the policy creation wizard. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and we'll go out so hopefully everyone can see my screen. It's always going to require you to name a policy. As we talked about with best practices, have a naming convention. One of the things I always like to do, for instance, when I'm talking about naming conventions of conditional access policies, is do something like put who it's going to be applied to in the first section, put what the scope is if you're doing, certain devices, if you're doing, certain restrictions, and then do the actual action on the end. I've also seen people do like the department that is the one that's going through and implementing it, then who the scope is applied to, then whatever restrictions are going to be there. It doesn't necessarily matter, but have a common naming convention. I promise you, if you don't and you get into a situation of where you have 30 policies later, it's a lot more work trying to unravel than if you go through and follow the same set guidelines. For now, we'll just call this one, we'll say all users require known location. If not, MFA. In general, you can think of conditional access policies as if-then statements. Anyone who's ever done basic logic or ever done basic programming, in general, conditional access policies are basically if-then statements. If this certain condition is met, then go ahead and do this actual stuff for us. As we talked about, when you're typically going through and doing it, the most common thing that you see is on users and groups, but they are currently working around the idea of workload identities. Workload identities is, okay, I'm going to do it for specific people or stuff like that. Most of the time we see users and groups. You can either do policies to all groups or, like I said, if you do select users and groups, rather than choosing specific users and groups, I'm a big fan of doing security groups. You can see I have different security groups that I've made over time in my lab environment. I would choose something like the security group itself to apply it to, and then manage the membership of that security group. I'm zoomed in a little too much, but you can see it then shows the group selected. If I wanted to go in and add more, I could go back in here and we'll go back into the security group and maybe I'll add another one. And then there's two for us to do. A common thing that you see as well too is directory roles. If you're wanting to, for instance, go through and apply something to all admins, very easy to go through here and to select the admins that you need. Role-based access, stuff. RBAC roles are always going to be a thing inside of Office 365 and Azure. When you're going through and looking at how you want to do it, it's a very common approach to how they segment out permissions and tasks. We won't talk about it today because it's not what the purpose is, but just-in-time access is actually a really, really cool thing to explore too. That's definitely taking least privilege a little bit forward and zero trust a little bit more forward. I'd encourage you guys, if you get the Azure AD P2 Premium P2 licensing, to explore just-in-time access, some stuff it can do for you. But for now, we're not going to worry about this too much. In fact, for the purpose of our demo, I'll actually go in here and rather than selecting the different security groups, we'll remove these. I'll add in my actual user that I'm on. We'll see if we can do this where I can get it to apply quick enough that y'all can see what I can do from here. The next section down is to choose the cloud apps or action that you want to do. What you see most likely for this, again, they have user actions. User actions are stuff like you want to request information from them, or request that they join devices if they're not already joined. And the authentication context is currently in preview. This will do stuff like secure specific application data. You see this a lot in SharePoint and in Cloud App Security, which, funnily enough, this is no longer called Cloud App Security. This is now Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, something like that. But yeah, Microsoft hasn't caught up with their own naming convention. For now, I'm going to focus on the most common, which is cloud apps. Again, you can go through and select. It's important to note, another one of our best practices, certain applications are going to have child applications as well. When I select Office 365, it's going to be SharePoint, it's going to be Teams, it's going to be Exchange Online, it's going to be Forms, it's going to be anything under the Office 365 umbrella. Similarly, if you look, I could specifically just do SharePoint, or I could specifically just do Exchange Online, or I could specifically just do Forms. So just know certain things are going to have child applications that you go through and look at it. In general, I like the idea of doing all cloud apps when possible. At the very least, you should probably be considering this when you're doing like MFA for all users, because you really want to provide protection across the board. The general concept of include versus exclude, this will get into understanding the logic when you're building out your conditional access policies. It may make sense for me to say, I'm going to include all cloud apps here, but I'm going to exclude a specific app that I've gone through and coded and added into my system that maybe can't handle modern authentication or something like that. Similar on the users, you have the include and exclude for users. Well, maybe I'm going to have a rule that says, all users for my system have to go through and do MFA, but I have that exclude security group for users that are on vacation or traveling out of the country that I want to give them a bypass to that. From there, you move down to conditions. This is where you get to some of the cool, nuanced stuff we talked about in signals. User risk level is right at the top. You can see if I want to configure it, allow me to do high, medium, or low. This is the actual risk level of the user themselves, not the risk level of that specific session. Most users, the vast majority of time, will sit at low. Some may rise to medium. If they're at high, you're almost certainly wanting to either block access or go through and make it more stringent going through. But just know that's the start of the risk-based stuff that you can do. I'm going to not configure that. We'll close that out. I'll be fine. The sign-in risk level is the parallel of that. Again, this isn't the user risk level. This is the specific session that you're going through and talking about, which again, there is distinction for Microsoft on that. So just know this is a specific sign-in level of how are you handling that individual connection for the user, not the user themselves. Device platform, we started talking about a little bit. If I wanted to go through and do device platforms, here's where I could say I only want to allow certain devices to connect. It's not that uncommon. We work with an organization that says, oh, well, we provide corporate phones, and the only corporate phones we buy are iOSs, so we don't want Androids to connect. Or, okay, well, we don't have any Linux or Mac OS in our system. Well, if you don't have any in your system, you might as well go through and set up a policy that blocks it as the extra security side. Again, you don't have to specifically just block here too. We'll get this when we get down to the access control here in a minute. But you could potentially say, okay, well, I'm going to treat connections that are coming in from mobile devices. So I'll say I'll select device platforms and do Android and iOS. I'm going to handle that differently than I would for other connections. Maybe for phones, I'm going to be a little bit more stringent than people that are coming from actual devices, I know. Locations we talked about earlier. You can see if I do this and I want to go through and select locations, you'll notice the ones you saw earlier. I could do the US, I could do the company house, I could do my house or the company office, stuff like that. I'll actually fill this out. What we'll do is we'll basically say, I'm going to say I don't want to block people that are coming from outside of the US. So how I'm going to do that is the selected location is going to be from the US. But if you think about this, this will be quite a bit harder, because if I say the selected location is the US, I then have to exclude all the other locations. How I actually like to do this one is don't have a selected location of the US, but actually go into the exclude and exclude the US. And then I'll actually write my policy to block access so that I'm blocking access for everything but the US. Hopefully that makes sense. Going in from there, down you have client apps. This is where you can choose stuff like browser, modern authentication. One of the most common requests that we see is we only want to allow modern authentication clients. The way that you go through and you do that is you say configure, and you uncheck the bottom two of these, then users can still go through the browser and they can go through mobile apps and desktop clients, but they can't do legacy ActiveSync and they can't do other clients, which would be like POP, IMAP, SMTP, stuff like that. Very, very common request. The final thing to go through and look in is filter for devices. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we don't have a ton of time left in the demo, but you could come in here and do stuff like look for very specific properties. So if you wanted to go through and do filter for devices, I could go through and look for very specific settings on phones or on computers that have stuff set. You can leave some of the Microsoft documentation on ways that you can do this, but you could go through and, for instance, say I'm only going to allow devices to connect that have a certain configuration that I'm looking for, or I'm only going to go through and filter out devices that have a setting that's, the primary user on this device is a service principal account. Well, if the primary user on the device is a service principal account, I'm probably going to handle that than if it's an actual user in my system. From there, we go to the idea of granting access or blocking access. Again, those are your two options. Under grant access, you have a whole bunch of different things that you can do. Again, some of the ones that I like are require MFA, the marked as compliant or hybrid ABE joined, required or approved app. That goes back to the idea of like Outlook iOS versus an Apple default app. Require an app protection policy. This is really a MAM thing that you're seeing from Endpoint Manager of I'm protecting my corporate data on that device. And again, you can require password changes. The other thing that not enough people look at, you can require all of the ones that you select or only one of them. So maybe I want to say that the device either has to be marked as compliant or it has to be a hybrid join, but I'll say I'm only going to require one of those, because if it's hybrid join, we're good. But if it's not hybrid join, but it's a phone, it can be marked as compliant. There, one policy can cover both phones and devices for me. Final thing to look at before I'll briefly mention the session section. This is new. This is where you get app enforced restrictions. One of the things that I'll say for app enforced restrictions, I kind of briefly mentioned it. There's some really cool stuff you can do in here. You can go in and, like I said, prevent users from downloading files from SharePoint to non-approved devices, which is a really powerful thing you're doing. I'm sure you're probably okay with users downloading work documents onto their work computer, but you probably don't want them downloading work documents onto their home computer at home that's not managed in any way, shape, or form by your organization. Very easily, you can do that through app enforced restrictions, where users can interact and function as normal, just like they want to do, but you also have the ability to proactively protect that data when it's not in conditions you control. Finally, you can turn them on or off. The last thing I'll mention before we end our demo, and if you guys want to get into more details on this, I'm more than happy to have a separate conversation. The what if tool is super underrated. How the what if tool works here is you come in and fill out the details. So you can come in here and say, I'm going to select the specific user in question that's going to be going through and doing this. And I think, for instance, for our example, I can go through here, any cloud app, you then just have to give it an IP. If you know a specific IP, that's great. But you give it an IP, select the country it's coming from, and then you can go in and do validation on it. So I can say, all right, in a hypothetical situation, I'm a user that's connecting from the United States. I'm going to be connecting on a iOS phone, and I'm going to have a modern authentication client. What happens with that? And what this will go through and do is this will actually go through and look at everything that you're doing. You can see no policies are applied. That's because I nuked everything out. I don't have any policies in here. But if you had like 15 of them, it would be a great way to go through and get an idea of under what conditions or what policies being applied to what users. A great way to test out hypotheticals when you're doing your design and preparation stage before you actually turn anything on. With that said, I'll go ahead and pass it back to you, Ken.
Awesome. That's such a great overview. Thank you so much, Adam. So let's quickly go over licensing. So again, there's no free access to conditional access and MFA, really. So the basic minimum you're going to need, if you have an M365 plan, you automatically have conditional access and MFA. If you have EMS, Enterprise Mobility and Security, E3 or above, E5, you automatically have conditional access and MFA. Really what it comes down to, and if you don't have either one of those and you just have like the E series or the G series of licenses, you can always add Azure Active Directory Plan 1, Premium 1 to get those conditional access capabilities. Now, if you want risk-based conditional access, where you can actually look at all these signals and have automation kick in and be able to handle some of these risk-based signals, you obviously need Azure Active Directory Premium 2. And there's a couple different ways to get that. Again, you can order it as a separate standalone SKU, but if there's a couple other things that you want in EMS 5 step up, like things like access reviews, or I know Adam's talked a bunch about just-in-time access or privileged identity management. So that's like no standing access, checkout approval process, right? Automation for giving no standing access, which is another zero trust thing, right? And then entitlement management, which is all about scoping out different types of use cases for workers and giving them just what they have, what they need for roles and things like that. So there might be a business case to move up to Azure Premium Plan 2, especially if you're looking at some of these risk-based capabilities we've been talking about today. Again, the way to get those is to step up either through Enterprise Mobility Security step up or go to M365 E5, or again, you can buy it separately as a standalone SKU. I know there's about $3 difference list price between these two standalone SKUs, just to give you an idea of ballpark of what we're talking about there. But there's a lot of value, obviously, in this Azure Premium Plan 2 that you get, specifically around the just-in-time access for the global admins. Nobody should be giving out. Nobody should have like full-time global admin access, and certainly nobody should be using their work accounts to be able to do that. So,
yeah. If you have just-in-time access, the idea behind it would be, even though I'm a global admin on the tenant, 99.9% of the time I'm just a normal user. And so even if my account got compromised, it's okay because I'm not being compromised as a global admin. I'm being compromised as Joe Schmo, and it's fine.
Exactly. So last poll today, and then we'll start wrapping things up. After today's session, do you feel like you have a better understanding of how conditional access can increase your security posture? Just take a second there. We would love to understand, if you figured some things out today, if some light bulbs went off today about things that you want to try. We just want to get some feedback on how the session went today. Oh, it sounds like overwhelmingly 7 people real quick said, yep, they learned something good today. So that's awesome. It makes us feel good.
Yeah, I'll also say too, I realize I'm way too much of a nerd. I could have talked 5 times as much as I did.
know you could have, Adam. As always, we love to put lots of resource material in here. So again, afterwards, this is all available for you. These are all hot links either to Microsoft documentation or some Learn training content. So definitely take a look at these after the session. And again, Adam did a great job with his blog, taking you through step by step. I know what he just did was very quick, but he actually goes through how to implement MFA across the board for all of your users with an exception of your admin account, right, Adam?
I basically did it as how to the blog write-up is how to turn on MFA for all users, except at my office. I want to give them an exception. And following best practices, right. I did exclude my admin account, so in case I messed it up. Always good practice if you're the one going through an architecting, exclude yourself at the start just to be safe.
All right, we have some time for some questions. I know we had one in advance, so I want to make sure we hit that one first, Adam. The question was, what is the impact of using conditional access versus other MFA options?
Sure, yeah. So one of the first things I want to talk about, I'm going to actually very briefly share my screen again if I can, Ken. We'll see if this works.
Sure.
Can y'all see my screen?
We're seeing it, yep.
Okay, so I'm going to hit 2 questions in one because there's another really good thing here. To get to the per user MFA with Office 365, you actually can do it through Azure again. You just go to the users tab, which is where I literally just went into users. And up here at the top, you see the per user MFA. It's worth noting if you want to modify what MFA options users are doing, even with conditional access, you do it through here in the service settings. So going through and giving the options of do you want people to call, do you want people to text, do you want people to use the authenticator, all of these options will actually be what you see in conditional access policies as well too. And you can allow if people want to remember the authenticator. The real main differentiator, the other thing I'll point out too, the most common request I get from people that are using this is, oh, user A got a new phone and now their authenticator doesn't work. How do I reset their authenticator? Again, go to users, go to the per user MFA, find the user in question. So we can look like, let's say I'm going to go through and I want to do this for Adam. I come into the manage user settings and this top setting right here requires selected users to provide contact method again. Just do that. You can notice it still even says that MFA is disabled for per user MFA. this setting will still reset the authenticator even for my conditional access policy. So probably the most common question I get from customers consuming it, just know that's how you go through and do it. But to expand on the question a little bit more directly, this has actually gotten better. I'm going to give Microsoft a little bit of props. If we would have had this conversation 2 years ago, the biggest downside of per user MFA was it was a user by user solution. When you hired a new user, you had to go in and individually add that user to per user MFA. It was a lot more arduous and manual and stuff like that. Now, with Microsoft having what they call the security defaults that you can do, you can go in and turn on a security default of something like MFA for all users. And even if you just have per user MFA, it will automatically grandfather people in. The real nuance of conditional access versus something like per user MFA in 365, or maybe even something like Duo, is the choice and options you have with conditional access. When you're talking about per user MFA, literally all you're doing is MFA for that user. And you can do, I'm going to allow MFA from known locations, or it's okay if we don't do it from that, but that's all you're doing. When we talked about conditional access, think about all the other options we talked about today, all the devices, all the specific application filtering that you can do, the risk-based policies, stuff happening for your users, all of those different extra options can be applied to even MFA policies for conditional access. And obviously you can do so much more even outside of MFA. So stuff like that, of like, filtering based off of location, of I want to allow people outside of the US to not be able to connect. That is something you can do in conditional access you wouldn't be able to do in per user MFA.
So it looks like PY has a question real quick as we're trying to wrap up. It says, if a user is blocked by a policy, is there a way to show a message, eventually custom message, hopefully, to the users that explains why the user is blocked and what the user has to do? I love PY. He's always thinking about the user.
Yeah, so yes and no. Honestly, this is probably my biggest complaint with conditional access policies right now. I was dealing with this earlier. Typically, if you fail a conditional access policy, but you signed in successfully, you'll actually get a message that your sign-in was successful, but there's other things that are blocking you. Please contact your administrator. Unfortunately, it is not a customized message at this time, PY. It's just a message letting you know that, like, there's some other condition you're not being met, but it is at least user-friendly enough to tell them that, like, no, your password's correct and you're good from there, but there's some other policy limiting it. The idea is supposed to be that you could then contact the user. I can't at all get into today, but as you dig into the Azure AD sign-in logs, there's actually a field in the Azure AD sign-in logs that says, was conditional access qualified for that login? Was it successful? And what conditional access policies went through and applied? So as you're going through and troubleshooting this, you can basically go through and actually look in the sign-in logs itself as an admin and find all the details you need there. And yeah, unfortunately for a lot of us in this industry, PY, that is correct. The contact the administrator is the ultimate answer. Excellent.
All right. So very excited about the next couple sessions coming up here. Microsoft Build is going on right now, or was this week. Lots of great announcements I want to talk to you all about. So we're going to have somebody from our Power Platform and our app developer manager is going to be on, and I think we're going to bring back Miguel as well to talk about all the announcements at Build, talk about the new Microsoft Intelligent Data Platform. So some really exciting stuff on June 23rd. Mark your calendars. Please come. We're looking forward to talking about it. And then further down the line, July 28th, Teams Voice update. We're getting a lot of folks interested in Teams Voice, where it's at. Is it stable? Are people really using it? What kind of things have we been doing with our customers? Would love to talk about where Teams Voice is currently and talk about some of the big deployments that have happened and talk about what it takes to roll out Teams Voice. So definitely come back on July 28th. Microsoft Information Protection, something that a lot of folks who just got E5 recently are all looking about, what does it take to implement that? How does it work? So we'll be talking about that on August 25th. And of course, we're still looking for volunteers. We may have to drop this because I'm not getting any feedback from our folks, but we would love to hear from you folks. If you have an app you want to show off, please let us know. Contact your account executive, and we'll be happy to work with you on presenting that to the YouAlreadyOwnIt customers. Just one other real quick thing before we close the book on this one today. We have this session coming up. This is in combination with Microsoft. It's an M365 meetup for government. Our own CTO, Andrew Kagan, is hosting this session on protecting your kids and keeping your family cyber safe this summer. We would love for you to join us. So please register. We'll throw the link in the window, but we'll be talking about understanding cyber risks in online gaming, stop hacking via social media and messaging apps, enhancing online privacy, and learning about basic cyber hygiene. So I know I sent it out to my in-laws already. So I want to make sure that they're protected, and we'll go ahead and get that link in the chat window. So be able to look out on that for in a few seconds here. And with that, we want to say thank you for joining us today. We really do appreciate you joining us. If there's a topic that you want to hear, please reach out to us. Let us know in advance, and we'll be happy to build it into our future schedule of You Already Own It sessions. With that.
I'll say from my side, I'm a nerd. I love talking about this stuff. If any of you guys want to have a follow-up conversation, you have specific questions that we didn't get to go to today, reach out to Casey, reach out to Ken. All of them get a hold of me. I'll be happy to correspond with you in email or even hop on the phone. It'll be really easy. But thank you so much for joining us. We do this because we love interacting with you guys, and we appreciate y'all showing up.
On behalf of Planet, thank you for coming. We'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.